Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by trackpads.com. Each week, we take one pivotal moment from United States military history and follow it from the first warning signs to the final outcome. Today, we go to the city of Fallujah in the Iraq War for the story of the Second Battle of Fallujah. It is a November night in 2004, and the streets of Fallujah form a dark grid of shuttered shops, walled courtyards, and low concrete homes. Outside the city, along roads and dusty lots near the Euphrates River, Marines and soldiers move under blackout, checking weapons and radios in the dim red glow of filtered lights. Engines growl at idle as armored vehicles line up, their silhouettes hulking against the faint glow of distant fires and the pale wash of flares that drift above the skyline. Overhead, the steady thrum and distant roar of aircraft circling in the dark remind every person on the ground that this assault will not be fought by ground forces alone. The sense of waiting stretches thin, because everyone knows the quiet will not last. On the northern edge of Fallujah, near the railway line and the main avenues, assault battalions get ready to cross the berms and breach the outer defenses. Many of the men have been in this city before, during the first battle for Fallujah earlier that year, when the fight ended with the city still in hostile hands. They remember taking fire from alleys that looked just like the ones ahead of them now, and they remember watching the operation stop short of bringing the city fully under control. This time, they are told, the mission is different in both scope and intent. The goal is not a quick raid or a half measure, but a full return, neighborhood by neighborhood, with no safe quarter left for the insurgency. Inside the city, insurgent fighters wait in prepared positions, weapons stacked close at hand in houses, mosques, and fortified corners. Streets have been mined and booby-trapped. Sight lines have been chosen, and killing zones are marked out in their minds, ready for the first columns that cross into range. Stairwells, alleyways, and rooftops have all been studied and rehearsed as firing points. To the Marines and soldiers staring toward the dark skyline, Fallujah feels less like a city and more like one vast strongpoint, ringed with hidden guns and unseen eyes. The moment they step off the line and into those streets will begin one of the most intense urban battles of the Iraq War, measured in houses cleared, blocks taken, and lives changed. To understand why this single night matters so much, you have to pull back from the edge of the city and look at Iraq in late 2004. The United States-led coalition is locked in a grinding struggle with a growing Sunni insurgency, and Fallujah has become its most notorious stronghold. After the first battle earlier in the year ended with an uneasy compromise, insurgent leaders, foreign fighters, and bomb makers flooded into the city. For months, Fallujah served as a hub for attacks that reached well beyond its walls, feeding violence along key highways and pushing bombs and ambushes toward Baghdad. Every patrol outside the wire felt the reach of planners who could stage operations from relative safety inside that dense urban maze. Politically and militarily, leaving Fallujah in insurgent hands carries a heavy cost that grows with each passing week. It undermines the credibility of the new Iraqi government that is trying to prove it can govern and protect its people. It also erodes confidence in the coalition's promise to restore security and freedom of movement on Iraq's roads and in its cities. Each new attack that can be traced back to Fallujah strengthens the sense among fighters and sympathizers that the city is beyond the reach of outside force. The longer that pattern continues, the harder it becomes to argue that the situation is improving. For insurgent networks, control of a major city like Fallujah offers powerful propaganda value as well as practical advantages. They can point to a place where they move openly, impose their own rules, and defy coalition patrols that circle outside but do not enter. Inside that shield, weapons can be stockpiled, roadside bombs can be assembled, and new fighters can be trained in dense neighborhoods that are hard for outsiders to read. With each week of preparation, more houses become fighting positions, and more streets become layered with hidden threats. Fallujah is not just another point on the map. It is both a symbol and a factory for the wider insurgency. For the Marines and soldiers now tasked with returning to this city, the stakes run far beyond their own battalions and companies. If the operation fails, or if it stops halfway, as it did before, insurgent networks will gain momentum and confidence that spreads across Iraq. Attacks along highways and in other cities could increase. Coalition casualties could climb, and faith in the mission could erode, both in the ranks and among families watching from home. A second, inconclusive fight for the same city would suggest that even determined assaults cannot break a well-dug-in insurgent stronghold. That shadow hangs over every briefing and rehearsal in the days before the assault. If the operation succeeds, though, it offers a different kind of message to both sides of the conflict. A decisive return to Fallujah might cut a major artery of the insurgency, disrupting planning cells, bomb workshops, and safe houses that have fueled attacks across the region. By breaking this stronghold, commanders hope to give Iraqi forces breathing room to grow and to stabilize other cities. That is why the assault plan pulls together Marine regiments, United States Army mechanized battalions, Iraqi units, and a full array of air and armored support into one combined effort. The November night on the edge of Fallujah is more than a prelude to a city fight. It is the threshold to a battle that will test urban warfare skills, joint cooperation, and political resolve all at once. The assault that now gathers on Fallujah's edge has roots in a grim sequence of events earlier in the year. To see why the city became such a focal point, you have to go back to the first time coalition forces were ordered to confront it directly. The return to Fallujah in November 2004 began months earlier with burning vehicles on a city street and 4 murdered American contractors. Images of their bodies hanging from a bridge over the Euphrates River flashed around the world and hardened calls for decisive action. In April, Marine units pushed into the city in what became the First Battle of Fallujah, fighting through tight streets under heavy fire. Intense clashes, civilian casualties, and mounting political pressure led to a halt, then a withdrawal, before the city was fully secured. Control was handed to a locally raised security force that quickly crumbled, leaving insurgent factions to carve up neighborhoods and dig in. By late summer, Fallujah had shifted from trouble spot to openly hostile enclave. Inside the city, insurgent groups used that breathing space to stockpile weapons and turn ordinary homes into fortified fighting positions. They built a network of lookouts, safe houses, and bomb workshops capable of supporting attacks far beyond the city limits. Roadside bombs, ambushes, and suicide attacks across central Iraq increasingly trace back to planning cells and bomb makers sheltering inside Fallujah. Each successful strike outside the city made the stronghold more valuable to insurgent leaders and foreign fighters who were drawn to its reputation. The streets that now lie dark ahead of the Marines and soldiers were already becoming the engine room of a broader campaign. Outside the walls, commanders watched the pattern of violence grow more deadly as national elections approached. They knew that simply circling the city with patrols and sporadic raids was not enough to stop the flow of fighters and bombs. Every day that passed without decisive action allowed more explosives to be assembled and more firing positions to be rehearsed in the city's dense neighborhoods. Coalition leaders concluded that another attempt to contain Fallujah from the outside would only prolong the conflict and erode confidence among their own forces and allies. This time, they would commit armor, artillery, and air power in support of a deliberate, coordinated assault designed to break the stronghold instead of simply pressure it. Planning for the second battle pulled together Marine regimental combat teams, United States Army mechanized battalions, and Iraqi units that needed both combat experience and a visible role in retaking an Iraqi city. Staff officers pored over aerial imagery, earlier patrol reports, and the lessons learned in the first battle. They broke the city into a grid of neighborhoods and phase lines, assigning objectives to battalions and companies street by street. Commanders rehearsed combined arms tactics that paired infantry with tanks, engineers, and air controllers for dense urban terrain. On briefing maps, the plan unfolded as a series of arrows and color blocks, neat and controlled in a way that the real streets would never be. The scheme that emerged called for a classic envelopment tailored to a modern city. First, isolate Fallujah so that fighters inside could not easily escape or be reinforced. Then, strike from the north, where open ground and key roads offered a cleaner approach, and grind southward block by block. The goal was to keep pressure on the defenders while limiting their ability to guess where the main thrust would fall next. On paper, the design promised order and momentum. Every Marine and soldier who had fought in cities before knew that once the shooting started, the fight would feel far less tidy. When the assault finally opened, it began with days of shaping fires that shook the outskirts of the city. Artillery batteries and aircraft targeted known strongpoints, key intersections, and suspected weapons caches to disrupt the defense and force insurgents deeper into their positions. Naval guns added their weight against hardened sites and command locations identified in earlier reconnaissance. At night, the flashes of impact and the rolling thunder of explosions marked the outer ring of the city. The men waiting to cross the berms felt each distant blast as a reminder that they would soon move into the same streets now being pounded from above. Under cover of that bombardment, armored columns and infantry battalions crossed berms and obstacles on the northern edge of Fallujah. Tanks and armored bulldozers punched breaches through railroad embankments, walls, and earthen barriers that had been thrown up to channel attackers into kill zones. Marines advanced behind these steel vehicles, stepping into the first lines of buildings as dust and smoke still hung in the air. United States Army units brought Bradley fighting vehicles and additional tanks alongside them, adding heavy firepower to smash enemy firing points and fortified corners. At ground level, the assault felt less like a single push and more like dozens of small fights unfolding at once along different streets. Inside the neighborhoods, the battle quickly settled into a harsh pattern of house-by-house clearing. Marine rifle squads stacked on doorways, tossed grenades into courtyards, and moved through rooms choked with dust, broken plaster, and shattered glass. Army crews scanned from their turrets, watching side streets and rooftops for the sudden flash of a rocket or the spark of a muzzle burst. Snipers on both sides turned windows, rooftops, and minarets into dueling positions that could dominate entire blocks. Insurgent fighters used their knowledge of the terrain to slip through back alleys, appear at unexpected angles, and fire from pre-sighted choke points where advancing units had little cover. Every house that looked quiet from the outside carried the possibility of a sudden, close-range fight inside. Commanders tried to keep some sense of control by tracking progress along named phase lines tied to major streets and landmarks. Over radio nets, reports came in block by block. Houses cleared, casualties taken, pockets of resistance reduced or bypassed. Air controllers worked to bring in precision strikes on stubborn strongpoints without collapsing entire neighborhoods or endangering nearby friendly forces. Engineers labored under fire to clear improvised explosive devices and to blast new paths through walls so units could move from building to building rather than walk exposed along open streets. Each advance of only a few hundred meters felt earned, and every turn into a new alley carried the weight of risk. As days passed, the assault pushed deeper towards central districts where insurgents had prepared multiple fallback lines and safe houses. Urban terrain magnified every decision, from when to call for supporting fires to whether to push one more block before halting for rest and resupply. On the ground, Marines and soldiers could feel resistance stiffen in some sectors and thin out in others, a sign that the defenders were shifting and that the battle was entering a more complex phase. Ahead lay clusters of safe houses, command posts, and last-ditch defensive positions where fighters might choose to stand and die rather than withdraw. In those spaces, the outcome would be decided less by the arrows on any planning map and more by small unit leaders making split-second decisions under fire. As the fighting in Fallujah dragged into its hardest days, the turning of the battle did not come from a single dramatic charge. It came from a series of grinding advantages that slowly stripped insurgent fighters of options. The first of those advantages was isolation. Before the main assault crossed the berms, cordons and checkpoints tightened around the city, and most civilians were urged or compelled to leave. Fewer non-combatants on the streets meant fewer split-second choices about when to fire and when to hold back. It also meant that many of the men who stayed inside the city were committed fighters, dug into their positions but cut off from easy resupply or escape. That isolation had physical and psychological effects. Fighter networks inside Fallujah had counted on the cover of a crowded city, where movement could blend into daily life, and where outside forces might hesitate to use heavy firepower. Once the streets thinned out, every armed man stood out more sharply in the rubble and dust. Ammunition and medical support became harder to move, and safe routes that once ran through markets and alleys turned into corridors watched by Marines, soldiers, and supporting aircraft. Time began to work against the defenders instead of for them. As Marine and Army units pushed south from the northern neighborhoods into the city's core, they focused on more than just clearing blocks. They steadily seized key intersections, mosques that had been turned into strongpoints, and clusters of buildings that functioned as command nodes. Each captured position did more than clear a few houses. It broke strands of the insurgents' communication network and denied them vantage points they had expected to use. Coordinated use of tanks, armored vehicles, and close air support allowed small units pinned by heavy fire to call in precise, overwhelming force. Over and over, defenders saw carefully prepared firing points blown apart under that combined pressure. Even well-arranged ambush sites that had been rehearsed for weeks could be dismantled by crews willing to stay in contact and adjust their tactics. A squad that took fire from a doorway one day might return with engineers, heavier weapons, and better angles the next. Tank and infantry teams learned how to work together in tight streets, using armor to draw fire and reveal hidden guns. When a strong point held out after one attempt, units came back again, changing routes and patterns until they cracked it. The message to insurgent fighters was simple. No single position would be enough to halt the advance. Another turning factor came from adaptation at the small unit level. Teams that began the battle fighting room to room learned quickly which approaches cost too much and which ones tipped the balance in their favor. They found new ways to bring engineers, snipers, and heavy weapons into play so that not every strong point had to be taken by walking into the precise choke point the enemy had planned. Leaders sketched mental maps of which streets and courtyard walls favored their own movement, and which ones exposed them to fire from several angles at once. Each day, in contact, refined those maps and made their next moves sharper. Iraqi units, though uneven in training and equipment, also played a visible role in clearing certain sectors and searching buildings. Their presence mattered beyond the immediate tactical gains. It signaled to Iraqis watching from a distance that the fight for Fallujah was not solely an outside force imposing its will. Iraqi soldiers and police moving alongside Marines and soldiers in certain neighborhoods added a local face to the operation. Even when they struggled, their very participation carried political weight on a battlefield that was always both military and symbolic. By the time insurgent leaders realized they could not hold the entire city, many of their best positions were already gone. Command nodes had been overrun, strongpoints reduced, and safe houses compromised. Instead of fighting as organized units along planned lines, Many fighters found themselves forced into the choice of slipping away in small groups or trying to survive as scattered cells in ruined blocks. Some tried to break out under cover of darkness. Others dug deeper into hiding places, waiting for a chance to strike later. The defense of Fallujah began to fade, not in a single moment, but in a series of decisions made under mounting pressure and shrinking auctions. When major resistance finally cracked, the map of Fallujah looked less like a reclaimed city and more like a set of shattered districts. Streets that had echoed with gunfire and tank treads were lined with rubble, collapsed walls, and burned-out vehicles. Marines, soldiers, and Iraqi troops continued to clear pockets of fighters, search for weapons caches, and mark buildings too damaged or dangerous to enter. Casualty figures on both sides, along with the toll on whatever civilians remained, underscored the cost of fighting a modern urban battle at close range. Every ruined house and cratered alley carried reminders of how high that cost could be. For the units that fought there, the Second Battle of Fallujah left a deep, lasting imprint. Names of neighborhoods, intersections, and specific houses became as fixed in memory as the names of famous hills and ridges from earlier wars. Veterans could point to a single block on a map and tie it to a friend, a firefight, or a long, tense night on a rooftop. Decorations, unit citations, and official histories told part of the story, but the lived memory lay in the smaller details. Those details stayed with people long after the city itself slipped from headline news. At the broader campaign level, retaking Fallujah delivered much of what planners had hoped for in the short term. A major insurgent stronghold was broken, and many experienced fighters were killed, captured, or dispersed. Bomb-making workshops, safe houses, and command centers were uncovered and destroyed. For a time, attacks that had once traced back to the city dropped in frequency. Coalition commanders could point to Fallujah as proof that determined, coordinated action could reclaim even the hardest ground. Yet, the wider insurgency did not vanish with the fall of the city. Networks adjusted, shifting their activity into other urban centers and rural areas where the terrain and local conditions offered new forms of cover. Roadside bombs, ambushes, and assassination campaigns continued, shaped by lessons learned from the fight for Fallujah. One hard-won urban victory, no matter how intense, could not by itself decide the future of Iraq. The war's outcome would hinge on many other battles, political decisions, and local shifts in allegiance over years to come. The legacy of the Second Battle of Fallujah reaches well beyond its immediate tactical results. For Marines, soldiers, Iraqi forces, and later students of military history, it became a case study in the realities of high-intensity urban warfare. It highlighted the value of isolating a battlefield and using shaping fires before ground forces moved in. It showed the brutal demands of block-by-block clearing and the constant tension between moving fast enough to maintain momentum and moving carefully enough to limit unnecessary damage. It also underlined the limits of firepower when facing an enemy woven into civilian terrain. For military professionals and planners, Fallujah offers lessons about planning, joint operations, and coordination across services and allied forces. The battle demonstrates how armor, infantry, engineers, air power, and local partners can combine to dismantle a complex defense in a dense city. It also warns that even the best-planned assaults must adapt quickly once contact is made, because urban terrain tends to bend or break tidy schemes. Staff rides, classroom discussions, and training exercises continue to use Fallujah as an example of both what determined forces can achieve and what such achievement costs. Those lessons are written not only in maps and diagrams, but in the lived experience of the people who carried them out. For veterans who fought there, the memory is far more personal than any case study. It lives in the names of friends and leaders, in faces glimpsed through dust and smoke, and in the sound of radios calling for help or reporting one more block taken. It sits in the knowledge that every courtyard crossed and every rooftop held carried a price that statistics and official reports can never fully express. That burden does not fade simply because the fight moved on. It remains part of how they understand their own lives and the war they were asked to fight. In that mix of hard-earned ground and unanswered questions lies the true weight of the Second Battle of Fallujah, and that is why it still deserves a headline. Headline Wednesday is developed by trackpads.com as part of Dispatch U.S. Military History Magazine.